After a man is broken by those who were supposed to love him, there is a silence that comes upon him. Not the weakness that keeps them silent. Not silence of defeat. The man who has chosen, and who has chosen always, and who chose the moment when he decided not to explain anymore. His silence. Daniel Reeves was no stranger to the power of silence. He had worn it for 3 years as a second skin, the whispers at the school gate, the empty side of the bed that still somehow smelt of her perfume 6 months after she left, the queries and feedback he'd received at work at performance reviews on his character. No one's had them for 8 years after he was excellent, and they somehow had a problem with him. It had worn him out. And he hardly spoke. His silence was interpreted as guilt by people. They were about to find out the difference. A person who builds something, you never know what it is until they destroy it and it's still standing. 38 years old, Daniel Reeves was a man that people would describe with the words solid and reliable, as if they were compliments, when in fact they are the words used to describe furniture. Dependable. Present. Not particularly exciting. When you needed him, he was there. He had lived his life the way he had been taught to live. It was done carefully, from scratch, and no shortcuts were used. He had finished university on a part scholarship and on 2 part-time jobs, and had gained a degree in civil engineering which he had earned in the precise manner that leaves no room for doubt that it is yours. Having trained at 24 with a mid-sized infrastructure company called Hargrove and Associates, he had been working his way up to becoming a quiet, competent, no one's favorite person, not for politics, but because he solved problems, met deadlines, and got other people out of trouble. By age 36 he was the senior project lead of the firm, overseeing a combined $40 million of contracts annually. He was responsible for planning the drainage system of a new hospital complex being built. He'd overspent the budget, but he'd also been on time, a feat almost unheard of in his field, so remarkable that his MD, a guy named Patrick Hargrove who barely spoke more than a few grunts and spreadsheets, shook his hand and commented, "Reeves. That was something." That was a standing ovation from Patrick Hargrove. It had seemed, in all the ways he was supposed to be, that Daniel had lived a life that was more what he would have wanted to have lived. A home in a promising area, purchased at the right time, and well cared for, like he had given everything. A daughter Imani, 9, with cheekbones like her mother's, and her father's serious eyes and a laugh that was uncomplicated. And a wife. Justine. Justine Reeves, Justine Abra, was one of those women who causes the rearrangements of rooms when she walks in. Not muscle-bound, not too loud, but had a kind of something he couldn't quite put into words. Presence, perhaps. Justine's feeling that wherever she went, so did things. At 27, at a birthday party of a mutual friend, he fell in love with her at a certainty that he could never forget of a serious person speaking of a serious thing, and knew that he was to spend his life trying to deserve her. It had been 9 years since he had attempted. He was not an ideal husband. He knew this. He worked long hours and was hard-working. He sometimes required the burden of great work to come to him in distraction, present in his body, but in part in his mind. He was not romantic as Justine sometimes needed to be when she was his wife. He had never been taught to love in action instead of words, and he didn't really know how to communicate between the two languages. But he was faithful. Faithful no matter, no questions asked. He was there for Imani in those moments that count, not only on weekends and at the big events, but also at the random Tuesday night, the after-work hours, when she was stuck with homework, or had a bad dream or needed to do some animal projects at school and was forced to make an extra trip to the craft store. He paid attention to his wife. He was aware when she was unhappy, and he asked, and if she answered nothing he believed it because she had never led him to believe otherwise. He had created something that was real. He was not aware of its being on fire. The first indicator, he would only notice it after the storm, like someone noticing the weather before the storm, was a change in Justine's phone usage. Easily dismissed. She had always been social, always had a full life of friendships and connections which Daniel could never have ever felt threatened by, since he was never given a reason to feel threatened. But there was something different. The phone when he passed, side to side to adjust the angle of the screen, the bathroom breaks that lasted longer than usual. He noticed. He put it in his part of his mind that wasn't supposed to know, and he kept on building. Marcus Webb was the second sign. Marcus worked at the marketing firm that Justine did, and Daniel had met him twice at work functions, and he was darn charming. He was like the kind who had to be charmed, and Justine shook his hand and that was it, nothing since. However, Justine couldn't forget about Marcus Webb. It wasn't a heinous or sensational discovery that Daniel was making on a Thursday evening in November, while Justine was in the upstairs rooms, when her phone lit on the kitchen counter, but rather a discovery which, for such a simple reason as being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, had no context whatsoever, and on which he stumbled upon 4 words that redefined the structure of his life. Can't wait. Miss you. He was in his kitchen a long time. Then he put the phone face down just the way he'd found it, and then he walked up and lay down beside his wife in the dark and started, quietly and carefully, bit by bit, without a hint of drama, to understand. A betrayal's worst aspect is that, for a while, you must keep on acting like everything is fine while you come up with a plan for how to handle the truth. Daniel was there for 2 weeks, in that particular purgatory. Going to work. Coming home. Dining with the woman he had been in love with for 11 years, 9 of which were wed, gazing into her face for signs of what he already knew, and now seeing them everywhere. The little bit of tension when her cell phone buzzed. Her laughter while speaking about work. The growing number of late nights at work. He didn't speak to her right away. This was not a sign of weakness. This is what a civil engineer would not do, who has not destroyed something before knowing what it was supporting. He was holding up Imani. Before he put a demolition event in his daughter's life, he wanted to make sure that he knew what he was in for. He talked with a lawyer first. At an office at least out of the view of his colleagues, quietly on a Thursday lunch break. He asked questions. He heard answers. He started to see what was to come. We are back at home and he sits his wife down and says with no beating about the bush and no theatrics, "Tell me about Marcus Webb." The next 3 hours were ones that he would live with forever, trying to forget. Not because Justine denied it, no, for a long time. However, due to the confession's implications. It was the rewriting of history which followed. Suddenly, all their marriage had become was a slow suffocation that she had been experiencing. He was unavailable, emotionally distant, consumed by his work, and not feeling chosen. The whole thing was done as though it was from a script. Who had ever needed it to be true to make what she did worth her while? He sat opposite her and heard her tie her marriage and hardly said anything to her. "You weren't here," she said. "Where you are not." He said quietly, "I was here every day. Physically." The word was inadequate, she said, adding that it should have been little. Presence was the least interesting thing that a man could give. He gazed at her for a very long time. Then he stood up and he went to see Imani, and then he came down and he would sleep on the couch. 3 weeks later, Justine moved out. The ramifications of what happened next were not in Daniel's plans. He had anticipated the sadness. He knew that it was coming. He knew that he'd have to get ready for it like he gets ready for cold water. What he didn't know is the story. Justine was well-liked, socially connected, articulate, warm, and had that about her, that presence, that made people want to believe what she said. As this went around their common social sphere, like a system that had been prearranged, her own version of what had happened was this. Daniel had been a bad husband. Cold. Absent. Emotionally unavailable. She had been yearning for a companion and a friend for many years. Now was the time she had finally found happiness. Would anyone fault her? The answer was, of course, no. Slowly, at least in a few cases, due to the force of gravity, the friends that Daniel had thought were his were heading toward Justine's orbit. Dinner invitations stopped. Group chat stopped when he posted. There were women that had stopped to talk at Imani's school, and now they were looking at their phones at just the moment he walked through the gate. Then it got to the job. It is not known just how it began with Daniel. If Justine had said something to someone who knew someone, or it was just that he was not in the circuits anymore. Maybe the social maths of him being absent. After 3 months of the separation, things changed at Hargrove and Associates. One of the projects he had been on, a major government infrastructure tender, had been given to another member of his staff, Brett Calloway, without his knowledge. A project that was his he was leading, one that was enormous, a project of government infrastructure. His fingerprints left on every page was given to another member of his staff, Brett Calloway, without his knowledge. Brett was politically savvy and had a knack for getting involved in other people's projects like a vine clinging to a wall. Daniel was taken to Patrick Hargrove. There are times when powerful men are not comfortable, and when Patrick was making a decision he could not defend, that's when he discussed team dynamics, about fresh perspectives. How Daniel had been distracted lately, a word that carries the added weight of a decision made prior to this conversation. Daniel understood. There was something said. There was something about his marriage, his character, how he was as a man, something that was enough to make it so. He returned to his desk and sat and gazed at his computer. He didn't speak a word. He opened his files and he kept on working. The worst was on a Tuesday evening in March. Imani was at Justine's for the week. The house was the quietude of a time and place that had been more full of life than it was at the moment. Daniel was sitting at his kitchen table with a water bottle he wasn't drinking from and a computer he wasn't working on. His phone had 17 unread messages, and they were all from people who he didn't want to hear from. At that time his mother had phoned twice. He hadn't answered. He cherished his mother, but she asked him with her silence questions that he didn't know the answers to yet. He remained there for quite a length of time. And then he did something that surprised him. He created a new document. Then he began to jot down all of the things he knew. Not Justine, not Marcus Webb, not Brett Calloway or Patrick Hargrove or the friends who had all departed. He recorded all his knowledge about himself, his skills, his track record, the work he had been able to do, the issues he faced and resolved, the value that he had created that was in the real world, in the drainage system of a hospital that was saving lives, in the transport corridor that was moving thousands of people every day, in 14 years of unostentatious, documented, indisputable excellence. He read it back. In his chest, something happened that wasn't anger and wasn't resolution, but was in the place between them. He ended the document. He went to bed. On the next morning early, he rose and began. As they were talking about him, he was working. This was not by chance. This was the plan. For the next 18 months, Daniel Reeves was quietly and secretly doing something that no one around him understood. He built. Not walls. Not defenses. It's not against anyone or a strategy for social reconnection. It's a case of restoring his reputation. He constructed the thing he had always constructed, the thing he was truly, actually, without the need of some other person's approval good at. He is beginning to work for the firm. With the government tender project gone, he turned to two smaller jobs, one for an upgrade to a water treatment facility in a rural county and one for a rehabilitation of a bridge that had languished in engineering complications for 2 years. He challenged both of them to take the on. He worked on them with a devoted, leisurely concentration, as though he had no time to waste on anything else. He managed the bridge in 6 weeks. The solution was a simple, elegant restructuring of the load distribution approach that resulted in the use of 18% fewer materials and, paradoxically, a stronger structure. It is the type of solution that elicits 2 looks from other engineers. Word spread, much like it does in technical topics, but with a sort of gravitas. Meanwhile, he had started to work on something else while Imani was at her mother's in the evening hours and weekends. 3 years ago, before it all fell apart, he had been working on a proprietary method for sustainable urban drainage design, which would be capable of cutting down on the cost of infrastructure to manage stormwater up to 30% in dense urban areas and enable compliance with new environmental regulations. He was working on it slowly, on the edge of his profession, like the careful ones work on things they believe. He accelerated. He obtained a patent for the methodology without telling anyone, via a patent firm he trusted. He started conversations, with the caution of preliminary, with nothing to lose. He went back to 2 people he had talked to at a conference 3 years before and began preliminary but with nothing on the line conversations. One was a senior engineer who worked for an infrastructure consultancy based in Scandinavia and active in 14 countries. One was a government consultant with long memory for good ideas in the field of urban sustainability infrastructure. He informed no one at Hargrove and Associates. He did not confide in anyone who knew him, and his circle of friends was small. On a Sunday afternoon, when she was sitting at his kitchen table, doing homework, he told her that her dad was working on something important. She lifted her gaze from her homework. What an important. The type that you'd have to take the time to explain, he said. This was something she thought long and hard about. Will it work? He studied his daughter. He studied her mother's cheekbones and his own serious eyes and the gap that had crookedly appeared in her front teeth that she kept touching with her tongue. Yes, he said. In her nod, she seemed content and resumed her homework. He also, secretly, started to write. Not obsessively. Not with a grievous spirit. However, the recording, and the truths it records, must be done with careful precision, like that of a man who knows that the truth, unrecorded, is vulnerable to revision. He owned 14 years of files of projects, of performance reviews, of documented outcomes, of professional correspondence. A very clear story about the kind of man he was, and the kind of work he had done. He organized it, archived it, ensured access to and completeness of, and was irrefutable. In the process of this documentation, he also stumbled upon something that Brett Callaway wasn't careful enough to cover up. In the final submission of the government infrastructure tender, which had been removed from him and given to Brett, there were parts of the analysis that were identical to pieces of work that Daniel had done for another project a year and a half before. Not copied verbatim, but organized in a manner such that it showed its source to any who knew where to find it. Daniel looked. He recorded his discoveries. He put the papers in a folder. He then closed the folder. He kept building. There is a truth and it doesn't have to be defended. On the outside, this Wednesday morning in April looked like any other day, except that it was 18 months after Daniel had started his quiet reconstruction and he was called on by the Scandinavian consultancy. The company was Nordvik Infrastructure Solutions. They had divisions in 14 countries, a recent contract with the European Union for sustainable urban development in 6 member countries, and were seeking a partner, not an employee, to work alongside on implementing an innovative methodology for the core challenge of the EU project, which they had identified as the most promising in their search for a solution. Their methodology that they had found to be was Daniel's. It was a 2-hour call. At the end of it, Daniel was being given a stake in a project worth 87 million euros, his approach at its core, his name on the intellectual property, and an offer to move to an office in Europe with a compensation package, by any reasonable measure, transformative. He sat in his car in the parking lot of Hargrove and Associates after the call, and gazed at his hands on the steering wheel for a long time. After that, he phoned his mother. She picked up on the second ring. Danny. Mum. His voice was steady, but there was something in his voice that made her go silent at once, like mothers do when they hear a frequency in their child's voice that requires their full attention. What happened? He told her. For a long time she didn't say anything. Then she spoke with the voice of things that mattered. I always knew. I always knew what you were. Sitting in the car parking for another quarter of an hour. Then he went back inside and asked Patrick Hargrove's assistant to schedule a meeting. He was resigning on a Friday. Professionally, completely, 2 months' notice, with the same kind of work that he had always done, because he had never done his work based on any consideration of treatment. This seemed to be very confusing to Brett Callaway, who was sitting across the office. He had one last meeting with Patrick Hargrove before he left. He left the folder on Patrick's desk. The folder that holds the documentation regarding Brett Callaway in his use of his work to the government for the tender. He didn't beg her. He didn't threaten. He just threw it there and stated, I thought you should have this. What you do with it is up to you. Patrick Hargrove looked at the folder. Looked at Daniel. Sighed after a long while. Then said, Reeves, I think I made some mistakes. Yeah, Daniel responded with a simple, yeah. You did. He gathered up his bag and departed. The social reckoning was less noisy yet just as thorough. It came not through confrontation but by a particular process of reality asserting itself over narrative, which is how Daniel engineered it. Daniel's partnership with Nordvik Infrastructure Solutions was reported on in 2 industry magazines and a regional business journal. It was not sensational coverage. It was the easy record of an important professional accomplishment. His name, his method, his work, in its rightful context and importance. Those who had been wandering read it. These messages started to come within days. Praise from folks who've been conspicuously quiet these past 18 months. Friends who'd managed to reach Justine's account of events, and who had now managed to make their way back. A very sophisticated message from one woman, a former close friend who had been very conspicuous in her withdrawal, so carefully worded and so much indirect about what it was actually doing that Daniel read it twice just to appreciate the architecture of the evasion. He responded to most of them. Briefly. Warmly enough. Before this wasn't warm, and this had been a warmth that had belonged to a way of these relationships that was no longer in being. Without being cold, however. He's no cold-blooded guy. That is what he was designed to do, he realized, and it was deeply rewarding, long, quiet work, and perhaps not glamorous. He was starting to realize that it was the kind of work he was meant to do, long, quiet. Not quite glamorous. Deeply satisfying. Vindication doesn't call. It just calls on time. Like all things. One evening, Thursday in October, he unexpectedly came across Justine at Imani's school concert. It's been 2 years since the breakup. 14 months after the divorce had been granted. She was with Marcus Webb. They had been living together for 8 months, something Daniel knew because Imani told him, and was told by her in a way that was neutral and childlike. In the intimate setting of a school concert hall, Marcus Webb seemed like a man who has just found he'd sold a version of himself that was hard to keep up with. He didn't seem the same as at those company events of years gone by. Which acknowledged Daniel and hoped, much desperately, it didn't have to. Justine looked well. This was her nature, she always looked good. But there was something in her face when she saw him, something that got through her with lightning speed, something she managed like a very efficient woman. They were adults. They were parents. They walked through the concert hall with the polite dancing of divorced mothers and fathers who have chosen that their kid is better served than they are. Just after the concert, in the hall outside, Imani was picked up by her teacher for the post-concert meal, but Justine was standing by the teacher. "I heard about the Nordvik partnership," she said. "Yes," he said. The pause. "That's a very significant one," she said. "I always knew you were," she said, pausing. Something that came across her face. "Daniel, I hope all of that is working out well for you." He looked at her. The girl he had loved for 11 years. The woman who knew how to rewrite their history for them to make things bearable. She who had given him back room to become what he could be, had left him too. He had seen what was in his heart, for there was anger, or victory, or the cold kick of the proved right. There was something else. Complicated. Human. "Thank you, Justine," he replied. "Thank you for that." And this time, it was meant, not for the compliment, but for the whole thing. For all of it. For the foundation that was exposed in the burning. Imani came up to his side in her concert outfit, full of that certain type of energy a child has after it has performed in public and knows she did a good job. "Daddy, did you see me?" He lowered himself down to her level, studied her face, his father's serious eyes glowing from within with her mother's unceasing presence, and said, "I saw every second." She grabbed his hand. So they went out of the school into the night, and the night was clear and cold and full of stars, and Daniel Reeves, 39 years old, a man who had been burned to the ground and found the ground to be sufficient, looked at the sky, and he felt this thing was so simple and so complete, it did not need a name. At last, he came to that which the truth had been pointing towards all the time. He never said "I told you so." He didn't need to. The work said it for him. The Nordvik project launched in 7 countries simultaneously on a Monday morning in March. Daniel was in Oslo for the launch, standing in a glass conference room overlooking a city that was not his but was becoming familiar, surrounded by engineers and project managers from across Europe who spoke about his methodology with the specific respect that professionals reserve for ideas that actually work. His phone buzzed. "Imani, Dad. I looked up your project online. It's everywhere." "Fire, fire, fire," Professor Biscuit says, "congratulations." He laughed out loud in the middle of the conference room. The Scandinavian engineers looked at him. "My daughter," he said. They nodded with the understanding of parents. He typed back, "Tell Professor Biscuit thank you. I'll call you tonight." He put the phone in his pocket and looked out at the Oslo skyline, clean and cold and real, and thought about a Tuesday evening 3 years ago when he had sat at a kitchen table in a quiet house and opened a document and started writing down everything he knew about himself. He thought about Imani's face when he'd told her he was working on something important. Is it going to work? He had known it then the way he knew everything that mattered, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with the deep, unshakable certainty of a man who understood foundations. Brett Calloway, he had heard through an industry contact, had been quietly let go from Hargrove and Associates 6 months ago. The circumstances were not public. Daniel had not asked for details. He genuinely did not need them. Patrick Hargrove had sent a handwritten note when the Nordvik announcement broke. 3 sentences. The last one read, "I should have protected you better. That is on me." Daniel had kept the note. Not as evidence. Not as a trophy. But because it was true, and true things deserved acknowledgement. The friends who had drifted had mostly returned in one form or another. He received them with the warmth he was capable of, which was genuine, if differently calibrated than before. Some relationships had been rebuilt into something better than the original. Some had been rebuilt into something smaller. This was honest, and he preferred honest. He had started seeing someone. A structural engineer named Adiz, 37, direct, possessed of a laugh that arrived without warning and stayed long after the joke had finished. They had been introduced through a mutual professional contact 6 months ago and had been taking it slowly in the way of people who know the value of foundations. Imani liked her. Had told Daniel so with the same serious authority she brought to all significant assessments. This was the only endorsement that mattered. He was not fixed. He was not finished. He was a man in the middle of his life, building, as he had always built, carefully, from the ground up, without shortcuts. The difference was that now he was building for himself. The meeting was starting. He turned from the window. He sat down. He began.